Commander Rock stood on the bridge of his warship, staring at the screen in disbelief as his tactical team confirmed what he was seeing. The humans were using ballistic weapons that belonged in a museum, not on a battlefield. Yet somehow they were tearing through the Zoral Dominion's most advanced shielding technology. It made no sense his forces had spent years refining energy-based defenses, resistant to plasma particle beams and gravitational distortions, and yet now they were being decimated by metal slugs fired with brute force. Rock clenched his jaw, refusing to accept the absurdity, but the data did not lie. The human ships, though small and unimpressive in appearance, operated with shocking precision. Their movements coordinated and deliberate, as if choreographed by some unseen hand, while the Zoral ships relied on elegant, sweeping firepower. From afar, the humans pushed forward with relentless momentum, closing the distance and striking at close quarters with a kind of ruthless clarity that Rock found both disturbing and strangely admirable. The sensor feed zoomed in on one of the human vessels, and Rock could hardly suppress a laugh at its crude design. Metal plating bolted over other sections, like a patchwork of war scars and desperation, but it worked. The turrets along the sides rotated with mechanical efficiency, and as the first barrage of railgun fire tore through a Zoral cruiser's shields and punctured the hull, Rock felt his confidence waver. How was this possible? How could ancient technology outperform modern marvels? His tactical officer explained that the kinetic projectiles were so dense and fast, they ignored energy shielding altogether, passing through barriers as if they did not exist. The realization hit Rock like a physical blow. Their reliance on energy-based superiority had left them vulnerable. The humans had found a way around it, and worse, they were using tactics that indicated a deep understanding of the Zoral systems. Every counterattack was met with a shift in formation. Every adaptation was immediately mirrored or bypassed. Rock watched helplessly as his fleet began to lose ground. The humans weren't just improvising, they were prepared for this. They came into the battle expecting to fight a technologically superior enemy and had planned accordingly. Rock refused to believe they could sustain this pace. He reasoned they would run out of ammunition eventually, and that would be the moment to strike. But that moment never came. Instead, humans closed in even more, drawing the Zoral into close combat where their elegant long-range weapons were less effective, and the brute force of human projectiles reigned supreme. Rock ordered the activation of their disruptor fields, waves of electromagnetic interference meant to cripple enemy systems, but the humans pressed forward unaffected. It made no sense until his engineer reported that the enemy ships were operating on analog systems, mechanical components impervious to digital interference. Rock almost laughed again, not out of humor, but disbelief. These humans had chosen to use outdated non-digital systems as a deliberate strategy, and it was working. Every high-tech advantage the Zoral had was being stripped away piece by an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. It was more than just clever. It was calculated and efficient. The humans were not hindered by their old technology. They had weaponized it. Rock realized that the more he relied on data and projections, the less he understood what was happening before him. The humans were unpredictable, not because they lacked structure, but because their structure was foreign to his way of thinking. The very thing he considered primitive was what gave them the edge. And as more Zoral ships fell in bursts of fire and shrapnel, Rock had to confront the grim reality. His fleet was being defeated, not by superior numbers, not by more powerful weapons, but by an enemy who had mastered the art of turning weakness into strength. The bridge was filled with noise as systems failed and officers shouted for orders. Rock gave commands to regroup, to hold the line, to reinforce weak positions, but it was like patching a dam with bare hands. The human fleet adjusted again, forming new attack lines and slipping past every countermeasure Rock deployed. He could see it now clearly and terrifyingly. The humans had been preparing for a fight like this for a long time. Not just technologically, but mentally they had trained themselves to adapt, to chaos, to exploit arrogance, and to strike where confidence blinded their enemy. And in that moment, as Rock's ship shuddered under another barrage, he began to understand that this battle was not just a failure of tactics, but a failure of philosophy. The Zoral had believed in invincibility built on advancement. The humans believed in survivability built on understanding, and that difference was proving fatal. Rock gripped the console, his claws scraping metal as he scanned the screen for any opening, any weakness in the relentless tide of human aggression. But there was none, only the steady drumbeat of railguns slamming into his fleet and the grim efficiency of a species who had no interest in spectacle. Only results as the lights dimmed and the systems failed. Rock knew that he had just encountered the most dangerous enemy the Zaral Dominion had ever faced. Not because of their power, but because of their ability to take the oldest tools in existence and make them new again. He stared at the Ihwa lead human ship approaching through the debris field, its hull scorched but intact, and realized that this war would not be won with pride or progress. It would be won with purpose, and the humans had brought that in full force. From the moment the battle began, Commander Rock could not shake the feeling that something was off. The humans moved with a discipline that betrayed the rugged appearance of their ships. Their vessels were battered, worn, even mismatched in design, and yet they operated as a single cohesive unit, striking with precision and coordination that surpassed anything the Zaral fleet had encountered. Before Rock stood stiffly at the center of the command deck, watching as another barrage of human railgun fire punched through their outer defenses. Each hit calculated, each volley landing with uncanny accuracy. It was not just their weapons that were effective, it was the way they used them. Every movement seemed deliberate, every adjustment purposeful. The humans were not simply reacting to the fight, they were controlling it, shaping the battlefield to suit their needs. The Zaral ships, which had always relied on their technological superiority, were struggling to keep up. Rock barked orders to reposition the fleet, tighten the formations, and concentrate fire on the lead human ship. His officers obeyed without hesitation, but it made little difference. The human vessels split and reformed like liquid slipping through cracks, and rejoining stronger than before, they pushed deeper into Zaral territory, shrugging off each attempt to pin them down. Rock's mind reeled, trying to piece together how such primitive tools could wield such overwhelming power. The kinetic weapons were devastating, but it was their strategic application that made them terrifying. These were not the random, chaotic attacks of a desperate species. These were methodical assaults designed to dismantle the Zaral fleet from within, targeting weak points, exploiting gaps in defense, and relentlessly pressing any advantage with chilling resolve. It was as if the humans had studied them inside and out, had prepared for this confrontation, not as an act of desperation, but as an inevitability. Rock's pride refused to let him believe that his fleet was being undone by weapons built with metal and magnets, by ships that looked more like salvage projects than war machine. But the truth was undeniable. The tactical officer reported that their shielding arrays were being compromised faster than they could cycle. Reinforcements, and worse, the humans were not firing blindly. They were striking at critical systems, communications, propulsion weapon cores. Their slugs were not just piercing hulls, they were crippling functionality. Rock demanded to know how the humans could be so accurate, and the answer chilled him. They were predicting Zaral movements with alarming consistency. It was not guesswork, it was calculation. The enemy had mapped their formations, understood their protocols, and was now using that knowledge. With brutal efficiency, he called up data on the approaching fleet and was stunned by how rapidly the human ships adjusted tactics, one moment closing the distance in aggressive waves, the next pulling back into defensive clusters, protecting weakened ships with a shield wall of overlapping firing arcs. They moved like a living organism, a singular mind guiding dozens of vessels. And though Rock could not hear the human communications directly, he was informed by his intelligence officer that the enemy used vocal transmission, crude and slow by Zaral standards, but evidently impossible to intercept or jam. Their coordination was not hindered by it. Instead, it flourished, each command a deliberate choice, each maneuver built on a foundation of shared instinct and practiced response. It was clear now this was not a wild gambit. This was strategy at its finest. Every time the Zaral fleet shifted, the humans shifted faster. Every time Rock adapted, the humans adapted better. He felt as if he were dancing with a ghost, one step behind at every turn. He had always believed that progress meant superiority, that advanced weapons and seamless data systems were the key to domination. But the humans were teaching him a painful lesson. Superiority without adaptability was meaningless power. Without understanding was hollow. The Zaral fleet had grown complacent in its dominance, and now it was paying the price. Rock watched as another ship was struck and broke apart in a cascade of flame and metal, and still the humans advanced tireless, unrelenting, driven by something more than technology, something deeper. It was not rage or hatred, it was purpose and preparation. And Rock realized with dread that they had trained for this fight not just in simulations or drills, but in mindset. Their entire strategy hinged on embracing their limitations, turning them into assets, and now the Zaral fleet, built for elegance and precision, was unraveling before them. The humans had shattered the illusion that advanced technology alone was enough to ensure victory. They had forced Rock to confront the brutal truth that warfare was not about perfection, it was about effectiveness. And no amount of sleek design or quantum computing could stand against the raw power of preparation, discipline, and adaptability. The humans did not need to outgun the Zaral. They needed only to outthink them. And that was exactly what they were doing, with every volley of kinetic fire, with every seamless formation shift, with every bold maneuver that defied expectation. Rock saw his legacy cracking under the weight of its own hubris, and still the humans came forward, unwilling to yield, unwavering in their resolve, each ship a statement of defiance, each round a message that they understood the enemy better than the enemy understood itself. And as Rock stood amidst the chaos of alarms, flashing lights, and desperate commands, he realized that the battle had never truly been about weapons. It had been about will, and the humans had it in abundance. Commander Rock paced the bridge as the battle unfolded outside the view screen, each second passing with a new burst of static as another Zaral vessel was torn apart by the relentless human barrage. He tried to suppress the growing frustration building in his chest, but the reality was undeniable. The humans were dismantling their fleet with an efficiency that bordered on the terrifying. They were not winning because of numbers or firepower alone. They were winning because they understood how to fight from a place of disadvantage. They had accepted the limits of their technology and turned them into weapons of war. Their ships moved like swarms of precision, guided chaos, always adapting, always pressing forward, always one step ahead of every tactical adjustment. Rock ordered the Zaral fleet had prided itself for generations on its technological advancement, believing that sophistication and elegance in design translated directly to dominance in combat. They had refined plasma beams that could slice through enemy armor from thousands of kilometers away, developed shield systems that warped incoming energy attacks into harmless light, and built neural network interfaces that allowed instantaneous battlefield analysis and command. But none of it mattered now, not against a fleet that had rejected all of it in favor of old steel, analog systems, and kinetic destruction. Rock struggled to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed about war. He had trained for decades, mastered every theory, studied countless engagements, but nothing in those teachings prepared him for an enemy that was so effective precisely because they ignored every rule the Zaral considered sacred. Their disruptors were ineffective. Their electronic warfare was being ignored. Their shields might as well have been decorative for all the protection they offered. The human weapons were brutally simple and stunningly effective railguns that fired solid metal slugs with such velocity that they cut through everything in their path. No targeting disruption, no energy absorption, just mass velocity and impact. And the humans fired them in relentless succession waves of high-density rounds that slammed into Zaral cruisers with mechanical precision, each hit carving through armor and exposing vital systems. Rock barked orders to reposition again, to shift defensive patterns, to prepare a secondary perimeter fallback. But the humans had already anticipated the change before it even occurred. Their formation split seamlessly, flanking both sides and cutting through the perimeter like it was paper. The tactical officer called out that they were adapting too fast, predicting movement with unnatural accuracy, and targeting their weakest systems with an efficiency that suggested either an incredible stroke of luck or a terrifying level of preparation. Rock refused to believe it was luck. This was strategy executed with surgical discipline. And the more he watched, the more he understood the humans were not Only fighting with weapons, they were fighting with information. They had studied the Zoral fleet, its ship configurations, its shield harmonics, its electronic responses, and most importantly, its patterns. And then they had built a strategy around breaking it piece by piece. He began to feel the edge of panic creeping into his thoughts and shoved it aside, forcing himself to refocus on the facts. The humans had an answer for everything. Disruptor waves, analog systems, projectile weapons, evasive formations, close quarters, combat, even communication tactics that bypassed digital encryption and relied solely on vocal coordination. It was crude, it was outdated, it was perfect because it could not be hacked, jammed, or intercepted. Rock realized the more advanced the Zoral became, the more vulnerable they had become to this kind of attack. Everything that once gave them superiority now made them predictable and soft. The human fleet pressed in closer, their ships ugly and scarred, but unwavering, each movement in perfect synchronization, forming wedges of destruction that carved up the battlefield like a surgeon's scalpel. Rock demanded to know how many ships remained, but the answer from the rear command was not encouraging. Casualties, mounting shields, failing hull breaches reported across multiple decks, and structural integrity on the verge of collapse. He stared at the view screen as the lead human ship pushed through the debris field, its bow scorched and dented, but its railguns still glowing hot with energy. They were not retreating, they were not pausing, they were advancing as if driven by some unseen force, some will to survive, that went beyond tactics or strategy. It was instinct honed through hardship. It was culture transformed into combat, and it was working. Rock had to admit the truth, if only to himself. He had underestimated them. Not just their weapons or their ships, but their mindset. The humans had not evolved their technology to dominate. They had learned how to turn limitations into advantages, and they had done it with a clarity of purpose. The Zoral lacked his voice. Hoarse, Rock ordered one final attempt to push them back. Coordinate a full barrage of long-range plasma fire. Lock all targeting systems onto the lead vessels and fire in unison. The crew obeyed, and for a brief moment Rock saw the human formation break. Several ships hit directly, and falling back, damaged, smoke and flame trailing from their hulls. But then, like a tide recoiling to strike harder, the humans regrouped and advanced again, faster, more focused, more deadly than before. Rock stared at the screen as the reality settled in. This was not a momentary resistance. This was a methodical dismantling of everything the Zoral had built, and it was being done by a species they had dismissed as primitive, backwards, and irrelevant. Now those same humans were rewriting the rules of war in real time, and all Rock could do was hold the line and try to survive long enough to understand how it had all gone so wrong. The human fleet closed the distance. Commander Rock could feel the tension on the bridge spike the air, thick with unspoken dread. Every Zoral crew member working faster, voices raised, eyes darting from screen to screen as warning signals flooded the command deck. Rock watched as the humans moved in unison, their battered ships weaving through the debris field with unsettling grace like predators encircling wounded prey. They had forced the fight into close quarters, exactly where the Zoral fleet was. Weakest, their long-range plasma weapons struggled to track and fire effectively in tight combat zones, and the human ships took full advantage, tearing through formation gaps with brutal momentum. Rock ordered activation of short-range disruptors, an electronic countermeasure field that had crippled countless enemies before. But it was useless. Now the humans did not falter, they charged directly through it, their analog systems immune to interference, their controls relying on mechanics and steel, rather than quantum processors and digital networks. Rock demanded explanations, his voice sharp as he turned toward the engineering console. And the officer there could only offer a stunned report. They were dealing with vessels built on principles the Zoral had abandoned generations ago. Systems designed to function regardless of electronic warfare systems that mock the very foundation of Zoral superiority. It was the greatest insult Rock could imagine, and the most effective strategy he had ever witnessed. Their disruptors were failing, and the enemy pressed forward, weapon systems screaming, as railgun salvos pounded their hulls again and again. Every impact was a reminder that advanced did not mean invincible, And now Rock's fleet had to fight in conditions they were never designed for human vessels. Swarmed like hornets, circling, striking, coordinating in perfect mechanical harmony, and for every shot the Zoral fired, 3 came back, harder, more precise, more targeted. Rock called for drone deployment. Thousands of microdrones released into the combat zone to confuse, jam, and intercept incoming threats. But even this was expected. The humans shifted tactics again, splitting into smaller teams, diving between drone clouds and threading through defense nets like it was second nature. Rock realized then, with a growing chill in his chest, they had trained for this, they had drilled for this. They knew exactly how the Zoral would respond, and they had built every element of their strategy around it. The main human formation was pushing straight for the command fleet, the heart of Zoral command, and if they broke through, it would mean a complete collapse. Rock gritted his teeth and demanded full power to forward shields. Even as he knew it would not hold long, the kinetic slugs being fired were simply too fast, too dense, and too relentless. Each one smashing through with thunderous, force-piercing deck after deck, and triggering system failures with terrifying consistency the humans had taken. Everything the Zoral dismissed as obsolete and turned it into a perfect tool for domination. They had thrown out energy manipulation and sleek design in favor of impact, resilience, and purpose. The bridge jolted violently as another round slammed into their flank. Rock caught himself against the console, his claws dragging across metal as sparks flew from an overloaded system. Crew members shouted damage reports, chaos rising around him, and still the enemy came on. He turned to the main display and for a moment stared at the lead human ship. It was monstrous in appearance, patched with old armor, blackened by flame and shrapnel, but it moved like it had purpose, its weapons constantly repositioning its engines, roaring. It did not care about looking strong. It existed only to endure and destroy. Rock found himself struck by the raw simplicity of it all. The humans did not need to dominate space with size or firepower. They simply needed to survive long enough to dismantle every advantage their enemy held, and they were doing exactly that. Everything about their approach screamed intent, discipline, and preparation, and it was paying off. Rock issued a final call for all ships to concentrate fire on the center of the human fleet to break the push, to create just enough chaos to scatter the line and buy time. But even as the plasma beams fired, even as several enemy vessels were struck and forced off course, the humans tightened their formation, shielded their damaged ships, and closed the gap again. Again, their strategy felt more like instinct than calculation. They accepted losses if it meant securing an advantage. Their coordination did not falter under pressure. Instead, it improved. Their pilots and gunners adjusted in real time, countering Zoral moves before they were even executed. It was no longer a question of if the humans would break through. But when Rock had never seen an enemy so prepared to die for victory, never fought against an opponent that refused to acknowledge fear or panic. Their systems should have failed, their tactics should have unraveled, and yet here they were still pushing, still adapting, still winning, and as another explosion rocked the command deck and lights flickered under the strain, Rock felt the slow creeping dread that the battle was already lost. Not because the Zoral were weak, but because the humans were strong. In the one way that mattered most, they did not just fight to win, they fought to survive, and they were prepared to do anything to make sure they did. Commander Rock felt the desperation growing as the humans pressed their attack closer and closer to the heart of the Zoral formation. He watched their ships on the tactical display, crude yet swift-moving, like a school of predators around his fleet's floundering defenses. Every maneuver from the humans seemed calculated not just to inflict damage, but to exploit a vulnerability the Zoral had never considered. Before Rock realized too late that their own over-reliance on advanced technology had created new weaknesses, the disruptors that should have crippled any approaching vessel were useless against analog controls. The drone screens that once provided a seamless digital shield were easily navigated by pilots who relied on line of sight and human instinct, rather than computer targeting. The more Rock observed, the more he recognized a pattern. The humans had adapted to every threat with almost mechanical precision, and they did so because they had already accepted their own limitations. and planned around them instead of pretending to have the best weapons or the strongest shields. They had built ships and tactics that could not be countered by the technology the Zaral so proudly displayed. Even the way the humans communicated on the battlefield defied Zaral logic, using speech and simple signals. They sidestepped the digital communication jammers and left the Zaral intelligence teams confused and scrambling. The analog systems of the humans did not care about data corruption or interference because there was no network to disrupt. Rock saw now that what had seemed primitive was actually an ingenious layer of resilience, a deliberate resistance to the very kind of technological domination the Zaral had believed was unbreakable. The barrage of kinetic fire from the human railguns battered Zaral ships apart, and there was no shield, no disruptor, no automated defense that could stop it. The human vessels acted as one formation, sacrificing their own as needed, without pause or hesitation, always reforming, always adapting to the next phase of the fight. Rock was struck by the simplicity and effectiveness of their tactics, realizing that his own crew had become dependent on systems so advanced that they had lost the instinct to fight without them. Each failed countermeasure was another lesson in humility. Each loss of a ship, a reminder that the enemy had not simply found a loophole, but had engineered an entirely new philosophy of war. Rock demanded one last analysis from his tactical officer, looking for any solution, any weakness. But the answer came back the same. The human fleet had no obvious blind spot. They were adapting in real time, their formations shifting in response to every move the Zaral made, every calculation countered before it could be exploited. Rock's mind raced as he tried to outthink the opponent, but each scenario ended the same. The humans closing in, pressing their advantage without mercy or hesitation. They did not panic when their ships were destroyed. They did not falter under pressure. If anything, they grew stronger. Every setback just another adjustment in their relentless push. It was a style of warfare that the Zaral had never prepared for, and Rock now saw how vulnerable their reliance on perfection had made them. The human fleet pressed even closer, their battered ships punching through lines and spreading chaos in the heart of Zaral command. With each salvo, the idea that advanced technology alone meant superiority was dying on the bridge, and Rock understood that the future of war would not belong to those who could build the most impressive weapon, but to those who could adapt the fastest and learn the quickest. As another railgun round tore through a vital support deck, Rock realized that the greatest danger was never in being outgunned, but in being outsmarted by an enemy who had refused to play by his rules. Commander Rock stood silently at the center of the bridge as reports poured in from every quadrant of the battlefield. His crew working frantically to hold together what was left of the Zaral formation. The humans were now inside their defensive perimeter, darting between crippled cruisers and disabled frigates like a swarm of unrelenting machines. Their attacks had not slowed, their coordination had not broken, and their pressure had only intensified despite suffering heavy losses. The humans pressed forward without fear, without hesitation, and with an eerie calm that disturbed even the most battle-hardened officers. On board Rock's warship, these were not the tactics of a desperate force. These were the movements of a species that had accepted casualties as part of their strategy, who knew how to trade ships for position, how to let go of individual survival to achieve a collective victory. It was no longer about weapons or numbers, it was about will, and the humans had brought more of it than the Zaral could have anticipated. Rock had never before faced an enemy willing to move into a kill zone, with full knowledge that half their ships might not come back, and yet do it anyway. With flawless timing and unshakable discipline, they charged through plasma fire, through drone screens, through fields of debris, not with chaos but with precision, like they had practiced every step of this confrontation. And Rock began to understand something terrifying. The humans had built their entire military philosophy on fighting with less. They had trained their officers to operate with limited information, their ships to function with minimal systems, their weapons to fire without perfect calibration. And it was that mentality that now gave them a terrifying edge. Every time a Zaral cruiser unleashed a full barrage, the humans took the hit, adapted, and pushed forward, each maneuver calculated to absorb damage while maintaining momentum. Their formations bent but never broke, even when scattered by blasts or intercepted by drone waves. They regrouped in seconds, tightening into new patterns and pressing the advantage. While Zoral crews scrambled to reboot systems or reroute power, the humans had already adjusted and struck again. Rock watched as one of his own destroyers exploded under a concentrated railgun volley and felt the sting of helplessness. The enemy was not afraid to lose. They had accepted loss as part of the path to victory, and in doing so they fought with a freedom the Zoral did not understand. The Dominion had built its war doctrine around preservation, perfection, and dominance. The idea that the strongest survive by never being touched, but the humans had thrown that idea away. Instead, they fought like creatures who had learned long ago that survival meant taking hits, enduring pain, losing friends, and still moving forward. They weaponized resilience in a way no algorithm could predict. No shield could block. No tactic could neutralize. They turned the battlefield into a place where strength was not in firepower, but in persistence. And Rock saw how that philosophy bled into everything they did. Their weapons were crude but never stopped firing. Their ships were scarred but never stopped moving. Their tactics were unpredictable because they did not rely on the safety of protocol. They embraced the chaos and turned it into rhythm and flow. The more Rock studied their movements, the more he realized that the humans were not reacting to the Zoral at all. They were directing the battle, forcing the Dominion's fleet into predictable responses, exploiting their rigid command structure, and punishing hesitation with immediate and brutal consequences. It was like being hunted by something that had learned every one of your instincts and now used them to trap and destroy you. Rock barked orders to reposition the remaining ships to form a close-quarters wall and engage the human vessels directly, knowing it would come at great cost. But it was the only choice left. He could no longer win from a distance. He could no longer trust in the strength of their systems, so he chose to fight the way the humans did, up close and without mercy. The wall of Zoral ships moved into position, weapons-charged hulls angled for impact, but the humans did not flinch. They responded in kind, crashing into the wall with terrifying speed and aggression. Railguns roared, metal slammed into metal, and within moments the formation was shattered. Rock gripped the edge of his console as the flagship shuddered again, a fresh wave of warning lights blinking across his screen systems, failing pressure dropping across multiple decks, and still the human ships came. The tactical officer's voice broke through the chaos, reporting that the humans were now targeting command relays, slicing through the backbone of Zoral coordination with surgical precision. Rock knew what they were doing. He knew this was the final stage of their assault, the moment where they dismantled not just ships but structure and leadership, where they turned the last vestiges of order into panic and confusion. And it was working as crew members shouted for orders and alarms blared across the bridge. Rock understood what made these humans so terrifying. It was not just that they were unafraid to die, it was that they had learned how to keep fighting even when every system around them failed. They fought from the gut, from instinct, from an understanding that survival was earned, not granted, and that made them the deadliest force he had ever encountered. As the last of the defensive barriers fell and human ships surged forward in a final push, Commander Rock stood in stunned silence, watching the view screen as chaos unfolded all around him. The human fleet, now fully engaged at point-blank range, had dismantled every sophisticated defense the Zoral Dominion had relied upon for generations. Their railguns fired in relentless bursts, every shot slamming through what remained of the shield matrix and boring into the hulls of Zoral vessels. With unflinching force, the sound of structural failure alarms echoed across the bridge, while smoke drifted from overloaded consoles and crew members rushed to reroute power or brace for impact. Rock knew with grim certainty that the enemy was no longer probing or testing. They were executing a finishing maneuver. With terrifying clarity, they had drawn the Zoral in, forced them to fight on human terms. And now there was nothing left but the raw brutality of close quarters. Destruction. Rock had ordered all systems to full combat engagement. He had deployed every last drone and weaponized every inch of shipboard defense, but none of it mattered. The humans had come prepared, not with overwhelming firepower or cutting-edge technology, but with an unwavering ability to survive, adapt, and strike with precise timing. Each ship moved in perfect concert, a brutal ballet of grit and purpose, their hulls blackened by damage, their turrets glowing with continuous fire, their engines burning with determination that refused to yield even under the most punishing fire. Rock stared at the lead human ship through the fractured display. Its armor scarred, its sides crumpled and warped by countless impacts, and yet it advanced without slowing its guns, hammering his cruiser with endless kinetic rounds, tearing apart layer after layer of what was once thought to be impenetrable defense. His ship groaned under the stress. Internal systems faltered, decks collapsed one after another, and still the humans pushed forward every advantage they held. Now was earned through tenacity, not technology. They did not fight clean or distant. They fought ugly and up close, with metal against metal, heat against armor, will against pride. Rock ordered his remaining ships to form a defensive perimeter, but the humans bypassed it in moments, darting through gaps, smashing through lines, and encircling his command ship like predators, closing on a wounded animal from the view screen. Rock could now see their faces magnified by the sensor array, hardened eyes, focused expressions, not of rage but of clarity. They knew what they were doing and why. Every decision, every maneuver screamed conviction. They were not here to intimidate. They were here to win. The hull of Rock's flagship buckled as a final round from the human lead ship tore through decks. 2 and 3 fires erupted across the bridge. Emergency lighting bathed the room in a blood-red glow, and yet the crew continued to fight, clinging to orders and routine. Even as the ship began to die around them, Rock's voice strained as he shouted for core shields to be redirected toward the front, trying to buy seconds to formulate a response, any response. But the realization had already taken root in his mind. They had no options left. The humans had outmaneuvered them, outthought them, and outfought them from the very beginning. Rock staggered slightly as the ship lurched under another barrage, the floor shaking beneath his boots and the bridge erupting in a cascade of sparks and smoke. Through the haze, a new image appeared on the comms display. A human commander, calm, unshaken, staring directly at Rock. With a gaze that held no hatred, only certainty, his voice came through clear and measured, addressing Rock by name, acknowledging the valor of his crew, but offering no surrender, only truth. You built your tactics and weapons on the belief that no one could challenge your advancement, the human commander said. But advancement without adaptability is a cage, and you never saw it until now. Rock wanted to shout back to deny the words, but deep inside he knew they were true. Everything the Zeral believed in had been dismantled by a species they thought had nothing to offer. A species that used weapons from centuries past to destroy the future. The Dominion had envisioned, the transmission ended, and the final barrage began. Explosions rocked the ship systems, died one by one. The bridge collapsed into emergency protocols, and Rock felt his knees buckle under the weight of gravity loss and internal rupture. He gripped the railing beside him, claws digging into the scorched metal as the walls trembled and monitors went dark all around him. He heard only the sound of battle and the screams of a ship being torn apart by sheer willpower from across the stars as the smoke thickened and the lights flickered out. For the last time, Rock closed his eyes and saw not the glory of conquest or the pride of technology, but the image of those human ships, battered yet unstoppable, closing the distance without fear, weaponizing their weaknesses, and turning survival itself into the greatest strength he had ever encountered. As the final layer of Zeral resistance began to disintegrate under the human assault, Commander Rock stood amid the dim red glow of emergency lighting, his vision blurred by smoke and his ears ringing from internal detonations. Rocking the ship, he tried to process what had just occurred, but the answer had been burning into the walls of his cruiser. For the last half hour, the humans had not just beaten them in battle, they had exposed the very foundation of Zeral doctrine as fragile and flawed. Their so-called primitive weapons had ripped through the finest shields ever engineered. Their outdated communication systems had defied the most sophisticated jamming technologies, and their analog control structures had walked straight through the Zeral's digital warfare nets. Without even noticing, they had faced down the Dominion's most elite fleet, not with overwhelming power or numbers, but with a strategy built around something far more dangerous. Understanding they understood themselves, their weaknesses, their limits, and how to weaponize both. And more importantly, they understood their enemy far better than Rock had ever imagined. They anticipated every counter, every adjustment, and every fallback position. Because they had studied the Zeral not just tactically but philosophically, the Dominion believed that superiority was a matter of advancement, and they had chained themselves to that belief so completely that anything outside that paradigm was invisible. And therein lay the greatest failure Rock had ever known. The humans saw those chains and broke them before the first shot was fired. They knew that advanced technology could be an anchor as much as a weapon, and they had tailored their approach with brutal precision. Each step of their assault had been a test of Zeral resolve and a dissection of their overconfidence. Even now, with the bridge collapsing around him and alerts screaming through the final working panels, Rock could feel it. The humans weren't just fighting. To win a battle, they were delivering a message, and that message was echoing in every railgun blast, every evasive maneuver, every moment of coordinated sacrifice that brought them closer to victory. The Zeral had relied on systems so intricate they could barely be repaired mid-combat, and the humans tore through them with ships designed to be rebuilt in motion. They had treated damage as part of the cost, not an end. They had accepted death not as defeat, but as a step toward eventual success, and they had turned each loss into a tactical lesson, deploying pressure exactly where it would hurt most. Rock had believed that he could overwhelm any enemy with precision, with sheer data-driven dominance. But the humans had proved that no calculation could outpace adaptability. No algorithm could outmaneuver instinct. They didn't seek to control the battlefield. In the way Zeral doctrine dictated, they shaped it with every pulse of movement, dragging the Dominion into tighter quarters and shorter ranges, until their sleek, high-tech vessels were rendered helpless, flailing with systems too advanced to be useful. In a fight that had become primal, direct, and devastating, the humans did not try to match technology with technology. They turned the rules of engagement upside down and dared the Zeral to keep up, and they couldn't. Rock could now see it clearly in the flashing readouts, in the desperate shouts of his officers, in the way his ship groaned under the weight of its own failure. The humans had stripped away every layer of false security the Zeral had built their empire on their refusal to abandon. The old ways had not made them weak, it had made them resilient and unpredictable. And as he stared into the heart of their lead vessel, now fully visible through the fragmented sensors, he understood that this was not just war. This was evolution, and the humans had already adapted far beyond the Dominion's grasp. Rock had no more orders, no more strategies. He could only watch as his ship crumbled. And the last defensive drones were swept aside like dust in the wind. The human fleet closed in one final time, and he saw them not as enemies, but as the inevitable consequence of arrogance. They had weaponized the very things the Zeral dismissed as obsolete and turned them into the instruments of a precision collapse. Rock's final thoughts were not of regret or fear, but of stunned admiration for the creatures who had reminded him too late that strength without humility was nothing more than a target waiting to fall. As the final systems of the Zeral flagship began to fail, and the lights dimmed into a pulsing red glow of emergency protocol, Commander Rock stood motionless at the center of his collapsing command bridge. His claws gripped tightly around the edge of the console as smoke poured from cracked panels and the stench of scorched metal and burnt circuitry filled the air. His officers moved around him, some injured, some panicked, some eerily silent, all of them still trying to carry out orders in a battle they had already lost. And through it all, Rock stared at the screen showing the human fleet still advancing. Battered, scorched, and relentless, their ships carried scars from the brutal exchange. Many looked like they should have fallen apart long ago, and yet they moved with even more purpose, as if fueled not by power, but by something far deeper. Every action they took was measured and deliberate, their formations tightening around the remains of the Zeral force, now little more than a handful of crippled cruisers and a few gunships barely holding position. He knew it was over, and yet he couldn't look away. Not from the lead human vessel still directing the final push. not from the calm voices crackling across the intercepted audio channels delivering orders with a strange sense of unity and control. It wasn't hatred that powered these humans. It wasn't glory or conquest. It was survival, pure focused and unwavering. They had seen what the Zeral were and prepared themselves. Accordingly, not with more advanced weapons, not with cleaner ships or smarter systems, but with discipline, with endurance, with a will to overcome. Rock remembered every tactic he had approved, every weapon system, every strategy built on the assumption that the Zeral were unbeatable, that no one could pierce their shields or outpace their data-driven warfare. And now all of it was lying in pieces around him, reduced to nothing by enemies who used words instead of neural links, steel instead of plasma, and instinct instead of probability. They had taken every perceived weakness and forged it into a strength, not just tactically, but philosophically, and it had left the Zeral with nothing to counter it. Rock felt something deep in his chest, not fear, not shame, but clarity. A brutal and undeniable understanding that superiority without resilience was useless, that technology without adaptability was a shell waiting to be cracked. He had believed in the illusion of control and the security of advancement, and in the invincibility of doctrine. But the humans had brought none of those things to the fight, and still they had won, because they had brought themselves their raw persistence, their refusal to break, their relentless need to survive. And that had proven stronger than anything Rock had ever known. His ship shook again, a violent tremor signaling a hull breach on one of the lower decks. And for the first time in his long career, Rock did not bark a command or demand a fix. He simply watched as the human ships pressed forward calmly, methodically, taking the final steps to secure total victory. And as the view flickered one last time, he saw their faces not in anger, but in quiet determination. These were not monsters, not fanatics. They were survivors, and it was that unshakable resolve that had undone everything the Zeral thought made them powerful in those last moments. Rock understood that the battle had never been about weapons. It had been about truth, and the humans had shown them one no shield could block, no strategy could outthink, and no pride could ignore. Survival was not about having the best tools. It was about knowing how to use whatever you had until the very end. And that was what made them dangerous, not because they were primitive, but because they were prepared to lose, prepared to adapt, prepared to rise from the ashes of every failure and keep moving forward. That was what the Zeral had never expected, and it was what had ultimately destroyed them as the lights failed completely and the structure of the ship began to fracture. Rock's last thought was not of anger or regret, but a kind of weary respect for the enemies who had taught him the most painful lesson of his life, that the past did not hold you back unless you let it. And sometimes the oldest weapons wielded by the most determined hands were all it took to bring an empire to its knees. As the Zeral flagship buckled under the final assault, an alarm screamed through the smoke-filled bridge commander. Rock stood surrounded by the shattered remains of everything he believed in. The mighty Dominion fleet had crumbled, not because it lacked firepower or numbers, but because it had forgotten the value of adaptability and humility. The humans had shown him that they didn't need sophisticated systems or cutting-edge technology to win a war. They only needed resolved discipline and the courage to embrace what others called weakness. Every move they made had chipped away at the illusion of Zeral supremacy, until all that remained were fragments of arrogance scattered among the wreckage of destroyed cruisers and disarmed weapon arrays. Rock saw it clearly. Now the humans had prepared not just for this fight, but for the inevitability of being underestimated. They knew their enemy would dismiss them because of how their ships looked, how their weapons functioned, how their systems seemed outdated, and they used that judgment against them. Weaponized perception and turned simplicity into strategy. The Zeral had always valued progress for the sake of dominance, building more complex weapons and tighter protocols, believing that perfection meant power. But the humans valued survival, and in doing so, they had made every part of their force serve a single purpose. Not prestige, not presentation, but pure, unyielding function. It was why they could charge into disruptor fields without blinking, why they could fire railguns with such precision despite being jammed, and why they could communicate in the middle of chaos with nothing but voice and instinct. Rock watched through the flickering remains of the command screen. As the final human ships completed their sweep, the battlefield once littered with resistance now belonged to them, and not through brute force, but through patience and resilience. The lesson was seared into his mind, and no amount of strategy training or technological innovation could erase it. The humans had turned everything backward into forward, everything obsolete into lethal everything, underestimated into unstoppable. And as much as it pained him to admit they deserved the victory, not because they had better ships or stronger weapons, but because they had better minds and braver hearts, and as the lights died out completely and the structure of the bridge collapsed inward, Rock's final thought was not of vengeance, but of recognition that somewhere in the debris outside a battered human pilot was looking back toward the ruins of his ship, with the same exhausted clarity, knowing that survival was never about being the strongest. It was about never giving up. That lesson doesn't just belong on a battlefield, it belongs in life itself, in every quiet struggle, every overlooked soul, every moment when someone decides to stand back up after falling. The story of the humans. And the Zarl is not just about war, it's about the danger of arrogance and the power of grit. It's a reminder that progress without understanding leads to downfall, that elegance without resilience is hollow, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the refusal to break in the face of overwhelming odds. And in our own world filled with challenges, where people often chase perfection over practicality or status over strength, perhaps the story of these two civilizations offers us something more than spectacle. Perhaps it offers a warning and an invitation to ask ourselves what kind of strength we're really building and what we'll have left when everything else is stripped away, because in the end, it won't be our tools that save us. It'll be our will to survive and our ability to adapt no matter how broken we may seem to others.